I would separate tennis rackets into three categories: power, spin, and control. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what a control tennis racket is. And a lot of it gets confusing, and sometimes there is some overlap between control, spin, and power. But I want to talk about four things that make a tennis racket a control tennis racket. First thing that would make a tennis racket a control tennis racket would be a smaller head size. So anything that's 98 square inches or less, I would consider a control racket. So this is a 95 square inch racket, this is a 98, and these are rackets that will be inherently more controlled. Because if you have a smaller head size, that's going to be less string movement, less trampoline effect, more strings for the surface area. So there's going to be less string movement, less of a power potential, but more of a consistent control feel. Basically, a tighter string bed is what a smaller racket head size is. Why you see a lot of professionals with smaller head sizes, they don't need so much power, but they want that consistent feedback. They don't need a lot of margin for error. So smaller head size, a 98, 97, 95 would be a control setup. A racket like this, an extra large head size, would definitely not be a control racket because that's going to have a lot of string movement and a lot of power. The second thing I would mention that would make a racket a control setup would be the beam width, just simply in millimeters measurement of the tennis beam. I would say 22 millimeters and less would be a thin beam, and a thin beam at the sacrifice of power of like a thicker beam. A thin beam will give you more feel at contact, that control feeling where you feel very connected when you make contact with the ball, as opposed to a thicker beam, a beam with over 22 millimeters. You get more plowed through, but you don't get the feeling and control of a thinner beam tennis racket. The third thing I would mention that makes a racket a control racket is its flex rating. In tennis, we measure the flexibility in RA units, usually from 60 to 70, although sometimes less than 60, sometimes higher than 70, but 60 to 70 is the major range. A control racket will be a flexible racket, so 65 and under is probably a good place to start. So a stiff racket, say something around 70, is going to have a lot more power potential and a lot more plowed through. A softer control racket, you're sacrificing some of that plow through and power potential, but you'll get more dwell time with a nice flexible racket, and you'll be able to feel that ball much better at contact and also be easier on the arm. The final thing I'll mention that makes a tennis racket a control setup is the stringing pattern. So the majority of rackets will be 16 mains by 19 crosses, or 18 mains by 20 crosses. If it has 18 by 20 setup, it probably is a control racket, just because that's going to be a lot of strings for the surface area. So an 18 by 20 is going to be a tighter string pattern, less of a trampoline effect, but more consistent, a tighter string bed. That makes it a more control racket. You can even have a 16 by 19 setup, but if it's, say, a smaller head size, like this V-core is a 95, and this Radical is a 98, although the V-core is 16 by 20 and this is 16 by 19, I would consider these to be a more controlled setup because the racket face in the stringing pattern is more closed. So even though it's not an 18 by 20, it can still be a control racket if it has a smaller head size, a denser stringing pattern, and creates a much tighter string bed. I hope you enjoyed this video on what makes a racket a control racket. I know it gets a little bit confusing out there when you have power rackets, spin rackets, but control rackets just look for a smaller head size, 98 and less, a denser string pattern, usually an 18 by 20 or maybe a 16 by 19 on a smaller head size, a lower flex rating, so it's going to be a more flexible racket under that 65 RA rating, and also thinner beams are going to make it a more control racket, so you sacrifice some plow through and get a little bit more feel at contact with that thinner beam. So I hope you found this information useful. We'll talk soon.